All right, so today we're going to talk about JupyterDash. So JupyterDash is a way to create a dashboard within your Jupyter notebook. Now, the pros and cons of doing this, a big pro to doing a JupyterDash dashboard is that it's very, very easy to debug. You don't have to like launch a new web. You don't have to launch like a new server to run your app. You like can have everything showing up in your Jupyter notebook just like this. Other pros, all of the graphs that are made with JupyterDash are actually using Plotly. So JupyterDash is by the same people who made Plotly. And so all of these graphs, they should look kind of familiar especially for those of you who have tried using Plotly instead of Matplotlib and Seaborn. So piece of advice, if you are thinking of doing something like this, as you're starting your EDA, it's easiest to just start with Plotly. One, so that you can get used to the syntax. Two, if you have EDA graphs that you want to show up on a dashboard of some sort, it's really just copy and pasting those graphs for the most part into your JupyterDash code. And then what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, as you turn it into a true dashboard, it is actually the exact same code that I'm actually going to walk through here. It's this exact same code that you just have to put into a separate script that turns it from a JupyterDash to a full dashboard. That part I'll talk about towards the end of the capstone because I think it only makes sense to talk about like full-on dashboards later on, but this might be helpful because you might be starting to do your EDA in the coming weeks. All right, so here's what's going to happen. This is actually the notebook from their documentation. So if you go to JupyterDash's, and I did link it in my last Slack message as well, but if you go to JupyterDash, not documentation, I mean their GitHub. If you go to JupyterDash, I do think that the easiest way is to start with a template first. And so they actually do provide a JupyterDash getting started template. So I actually got it from here in notebooks, getting started. This is the exact thing that we're going to walk through. Only thing I'm going to do now is as I talk through these things, I'm going to comment on the code or like highlight what is good to remember. So if you're watching this video back, you can follow the code a little bit better because I think they don't really say what exactly all of these things are. And it does look a little bit overwhelming in my opinion. So the dashboard that we're going to look and see like how they've created is this dashboard right here. Exact same one down here. I put it next to each other so I don't have to keep going up and down. But here is basically we're showing different countries. Is it economical indicators or I think it's just like, yeah, just indicators. They're economical ones. I think there's a few on like demographic information. So the dashboard that we have here, I would say there are a couple main elements that I'm going to talk about. One, layout. So here you can see that there are 3 graphs. 2, or actually 3 components. 1, the layout. 2, the updating. So for example, this is actually where you compare 2 different indicators. So actually, I think it's easier if I show you all the data to start, and I'll zoom into this too in a bit. But if I take a look at the DF here, and let me zoom into this here, this is the data that we're going to be working with. This whole data frame, actually, let me just knock through the head. So you have about almost 37,000 rows from a bunch of different countries. Every country has the data for a set number of indicators over a certain number of years. So that's how we have so many different data points. So this is the data that we're working with. The dashboard that's going to show up, and actually I'm just going to use the one over here on this side. The dashboard that's going to show up allows us to compare 2 indicators at once. So remember like when we were doing like, I don't know, like linear regression, multicollinearity, if we just wanted to see like, are 2 variables related to each other? That's where you can update the variables up here. So on these, in this top 2 like drop-down bars, you can actually change, all right, let's say I want to look at population density versus fertility rate, for example. Here's your scatter plot. Here is like if you hover over a specific country, oh, that's Singapore, that's me. This is like the trend for each, and then also at a specific year, what is the what does the scatter plot look like for a specific year? So a lot of different elements here. We have first the indicators, we also have the year, and then on top of that, as you can see, this is not very useful. So it allows us to take a look at a log of the distribution. Because if you remember, taking the log of something turns something from being more skewed to slightly more normal. So if you have like a graph that looks like this, oftentimes if you log it, so for example, this x-axis now is in a log format. See, it goes from 0.1 to 1 to 10 to 100 to 1000. You can actually see the distribution a little clearer. Just keep in mind it's no longer linear. Any questions regarding the data that we're working with before we get into how we create this representation of the data? Awesome. Okay, so the code is a little bit complicated, and what I'm going to do is, and I do suggest that you all do this too if you want to work with a dashboard. Feel free to take this code and just update it to create your own dashboard. I do think that it is much easier than starting 100% from scratch. Before even starting with a dashboard, or before even starting to code out a dashboard, highly recommend you try and envision with as much detail as possible how you want your dashboard layout to look like. So here, the dashboard layout, as you see here, you have a couple different components. Overall, it is built out in 2 different columns. So there's like the left column, the right column. In the left column, you have this graph. In the right column, we have these 2. And something else to consider here, because you have this 3rd axis of time, they added another component where you can add this, just have like a slider for time. That's something that you want to consider in your design. So yeah, basically design the dashboard with as much detail as you can before you start coding it out. From as far as I know, Dash works in like columns and rows. So later we're actually going to see in the code, this is going to be 1 column. This is going to be 1 column. Within this column, there are 2 rows. So if you can like literally draw out like what the columns and rows are in your dashboard, that can also help when you're about to code it out. Think about the components that you want. If you have like multiple different columns, you want a drop-down list. A drop-down list is something that you have to consider. And you have to remember that you have to add that component as well. And also when you have your drop-down lists, what gets updated? So the difference, I think, between going from just EDA graphs to a dashboard is the dashboard usually has some interactive component, right? The fact that I can update all of my graphs based on what indicators I'm selecting, that is a functionality of a dashboard. You can't really do that with just like plain old EDA graphs. Also, when I hover over these, note how these update depending on the country. So that's something that you have to keep in mind as well. This is a slightly more complicated dashboard because there's so many different variables going around at once. But I think it's a good example for us to go off of because, yeah, yours will probably be a little simpler. I mean, it really depends on your data. So yeah. For context, if you all would like to know, back when I was a student, this was our Mod 1 project. So I had to do this in Mod 1. It was very traumatizing for me as a student in Mod 1 to have to do this. I thought I was never going to be able to code. So it is very complicated. But sitting down with it and taking the time to like look through all the components, it'll start to slowly make sense. As I'm walking through this, you'll see that even for me, like some of the more like HTML elements of this code, I'm not as familiar with because I don't code in HTML, but I'll talk about the main things and how I make sense of it. All right, so let's talk about that giant block of code here. So, oops, I didn't mean to zoom. Let's zoom, actually, yeah, let's zoom out on this and out on this as well. So this is the entire notebook. Creating this dashboard is this gigantic block of code, which I'm actually going to break down for you all so you know what refers to what, when you change what should change. Before even getting to that, in your JupyterDash, I do recommend that you do it in a separate notebook from everything else because running a dashboard or the notebook can get very computationally heavy. So you don't want to overload your notebook because you don't want your kernel to die as you keep testing out your dashboard. The less that you have running concurrently with your dashboard, the more efficient it's going to be when you like try to debug or edit something. So highly recommend having your JupyterDash in its own notebook, and then you just import whatever relevant data you want to show on your dashboard. So similarly, just imagine, let's say like this is just all of my data put together. And yeah, this is, I don't need to do too much pre-processing from getting to here to my graphs. And that would be ideal because you don't want to have all your pre-processing steps as well, because pandas also will start to take up a lot of space. All right, so in terms of imports, we're going to look at, well, first of all, we have to import JupyterDash. Dash is actually the library that creates the dashboard. So you'll see that when we move this from JupyterDash to a dashboard, it's actually all the same. The only thing that we don't have is this very first line. So Dash is the library that allows you to create the graphs, create like the interactive elements, create like the updating of each graph when you hover over something. Within Dash, and I think this is an easy way to start thinking about it when you're planning, you have Dash core components. And actually, let me pull up the documentation real quick. So a core component is, you can think of like every building block of your dashboard is a core component. So you can see here, this is their documentation, and everything on the side here, I know it's kind of small right now, but this is all of the core components. So in this scenario, in this example dashboard, each of these drop-down lists is a core component. Each of these like linear log things is a core component. Every graph is a core component. And lastly, like every slider is a core component, which is pretty neat. There are a lot of others. For example, we saw this drop-down list already. So this is just like a regular drop-down list. Here you can see that you have like the drop-downs where you can like add multiple things at once. So for example, if you want to compare, I don't know, I know one student that recently did this, wanted to compare the stats of multiple sports players. And so you can just have like as many keep popping up on the graph at the same time based on what you have here. Slider, this is what we had here. I'm just going to go through some like main ones. If you're doing like something NLP and you want to run your model in a dashboard, you can. You can actually have like an input box and then you submit, and then have taking that input, run it through your model, spit out an output. That can be part of your dashboard too. So yeah, feel free to like, I think as you're building your dashboard and thinking about what you can incorporate into your dashboard, it is good to just look through and see what these core components are. So that's why we're importing core components. You'll see that our dashboard is going to be made up of a bunch of dash core components. Anything labeled like BCC is a core component. The next thing that we're importing is also HTML components, because Dash is actually built using kind of HTML. We'll see that, you know, for any of like the headers or the text, I think we'll use some HTML components. So anything with HTML dot something will be an HTML component. And then finally we have pandas, just because our data is pandas. Okay. Few more things before we get into the actual meat of the dashboard. When you're creating an app, this is an external style sheet. I am not super familiar with CSS, but the way I understand external style sheets is that if you have like a theme that you want, you can actually look up external style sheets that will have all of like the formatting, the fonts, the colors, all matching some theme, and then you can import like a specific style sheet. And there are a bunch of different ones. This is actually the one that's like, I think, used mostly by anything Plotly. So we're just going to use this. And this is the one in the example too.
So quick question. Within this, can we write the HTML codes for CSS?
Can you write the HTML code for CSS? Technically, yes.
Okay.
I would say it is probably easier if you just stick with using a style sheet. Unless you know how to write a style sheet for yourself, then great. But I don't think any of you'd have that experience. I don't have that experience. I definitely don't know how to do that.
I understand the CSS style, because like we work on a lot of websites, right? So on the background, right, we do have those things, but like I'm not sure how to implement the so in HTML we write open, close the body, we do, right? So we can actually right, have different cascading styles for things done.
Yeah.
So the same style sheet code will work here. I am. I need to maybe research a bit.
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. I've never like tried to implement like custom CSS on like my dashboard just because for me, I feel like their default looks fine. But I have seen projects where like people like change the whole color scheme, the fonts. And to my knowledge, they do it with a style sheet, but I'm not too sure on that front.
Yeah, it's basically like how you place right each of the right boxes, right? And I mean, if you want to just right show it side by side, your explanation and the right graph parallelly, okay, you do that. There are some people who want to show the graph on the top and then like write the description below every, I mean, every image, you know.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
things like
I mean, I think that would be cool if you can implement like your own CSS, not the main point of a capstone at all. We are a data science program. That's not the main point, but I think it'll be cool. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, if you do it, I might end up learning a bunch as well.
Yes. Quick question. Well, side note, I'm so happy to see this external style sheet because I've done CSS stuff and I do not. Yeah, I'm so happy to see that.
Great.
But one of the things that I'm wondering is like, how does this connect to like if you had this dashboard and then you also were using AWS, for example? Like, are you going to get into that or
like how can I host this dashboard on AWS?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I was just wondering as you were going through it is, where does the connection happen to, to connect this dashboard to AWS?
Gotcha. I'm not going to talk specifically about putting a dashboard on AWS. I'm going to talk about how you can host it on a website, which is, I think, kind of similar to putting on AWS, just not using AWS specifically. I imagine the processes will be the same. Other things that you can consider, like for example, our last study group, we talked about how we can put our data in SQL. And your SQL tables could live on AWS, like I talked about on Thursday. And so connecting your data on AWS to a JupyterDash is really just a matter of how do you import, like how you read your tables. So you would just do like the cursor dot execute, you would like import all of those like cursors, those engines here. And then you can actually talk to the data that lives on AWS and have it stream your data directly onto your JupyterDash. That part I unfortunately am not really going to talk about, but it's pretty simple to set up.
But then, I mean, I think you'll get to it, but even with what you're referring to, like to connect it to, I think you said just, what did you say as far as the,
to put this on like a website that anyone can like go to and see.
And all of that would happen within the notebook as well?
Not exactly. The pro of starting with JupyterDash is that it's easy to debug your code in a Jupyter notebook, but and this will come like towards the end of the capstone phase. I'll do a whole session on like how do I turn this into something that you can put online. For this kind of dashboard to go online, it is really just a big chunk of copy paste, which is great.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I'll talk about that probably like, I'm thinking like week 6 or 7.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
Cool. You're welcome. Where was I? Okay. So that's an external style sheet. Next, you have to instantiate your app. Instantiating the app, very similar to like instantiating a model, instantiating an object. So we're going to instantiate an app. I don't know why it has to be called name. That's what it is. And you would tell your external style sheet what style sheet it is there. If you don't have an external style sheet, you don't even have to have that there. So you instantiate your app and then you create a server for it. I'm going to talk about, so once you instantiate your app, this is where you determine how your app is laid out. And I'll get into that later. But basically, after you define all your layout, the way that you run your app, which is pretty neat, there are a couple ways to do it, depending on what you use. So how I have this on like a separate window, and you can see here is like a local host. if I run this, it tells me that I can go onto this local web page and pull up my app, which is great. Alternatively, and this is an alternative, if you want to run it within your notebook, you can do it inline. So you do mode equals to inline, and that's how I'm rendering it within the notebook. So it depends on like, do you want to like debug it side by side or debug it up and down? It's really up to you. Finally, if you're using JupyterLab, I think a couple of you do use JupyterLab. So if you use mode equals JupyterLab, you can actually have it open in a brand new tab in JupyterLab, which is neat as well. I personally have not tested it because I don't use JupyterLab, but I've heard that it works. All right, so those are like everything else about like adjacent to the app itself. So we're gonna get into the app itself.
One quick question. Now, if I want, let's say I have web hosting with different places, and like I want to host this particular right page on one of the pages which I have, one of the right servers which I have there, I just want to host it.
Yeah.
Right, as a subdomain for my website or anything. So in that case, do I need to just plug in the what do you say, the address here, or do I need to?
Oh, good point. I have never done that, to be honest, but I know that you can extract all the HTML that makes this, and I imagine you can embed it, but I'm not 100% sure, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah. I think on their documentation, they actually talk about it. Like production capability, like how you can deploy your app. And if you want to embed you can embed your Dash app in on another website, and there's like a whole, I've never had to do this, so I have no idea what we're scrolling through right now, but you can definitely do that.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, let's get into the meat of this. This is the part that it is very confusing, but I'm going to label this code as much as possible. So when it does come time for you to start putting together your dashboard, you at least have a better idea of where to start. Okay, so in this giant block of code, of course, we already talked about these starting lines. We have two main things. We have the layout. And if you see, the layout is actually one giant HTML div. If you remember div, think of div as like a building block of your dashboard. So divs can live within divs. So basically, this whole thing is a giant div. I think each of these are in a div. This is one, this is another one. So you're gonna see nested divs. So this whole thing is a div, and we'll get into details of that. So you see where this starts, it actually ends over here. It ends down here. So this entire thing here, let me zoom out so we can see the scale of this. This entire thing here lays out your dashboard, and we'll get into like specifics in a little bit. Everything below this is called a callback. And callbacks are basically anything that will update one of your graphs automatically. And there are a bunch of them defined over here. And I'm going to walk through the things that you have to consider, and I guess how you would put together a callback. But if you want like some sort of interactive element, you have to have these callbacks. So first you have how everything is laid out, and then you have how everything updates. And so anything, and you'll see here, anything that has like a app callback, that is a callback. And usually when you're doing a dashboard, especially with JupyterDash, you always have your callbacks at the end. So yeah, any clarification on that? We have two components, one our layout and then the callbacks.
So if it's just a random question, but if my internet goes out and I've loaded that page up, can I still toggle with those different settings?
Yeah, the good news is this dashboard is actually local. It's fully local. Unless your data is online or you're having it deploy on something that requires the internet, you can actually work on this completely offline.
Gotcha.
So actually, let me also put in here, callbacks are all here onwards. Okay, let me just make more space between all of it. All right, so to start, let's talk about the layout. I'm gonna keep it zoomed out for now, and then I'll zoom, let's see, where do we get the full layout? Okay, I think this is the full layout right over here. Okay, this is the entire layout of our graph. And I'll show you how they've decided to lay this specific dashboard out. So you can sort of see it, I guess, based on the indents, but we have one giant div. And then within the giant div, there are actually two main divs, I would say. Or yeah, let's go with two. So within this first div, there's this one here, this div here. And if you and this div is actually everything on, I want to say, let's see, drop down radio. Oh, okay. So this div here is this entire top part of the dashboard. Now, how I know that is I take a look and see what's inside. So within this top part div, there are more divs. So as I said, there are a lot of nesting. There's a lot of nesting going on. But we can actually sort of see what is what here. So within this one div, there are actually two more divs, the left side and then the right side. So you can see here, this is the left side div, and then this is the right side div, this one specifically. And then this sets the style for the entire top. But basically how this is broken down is this, actually, let me annotate with some squares so it's easier to see. Now we're talking about, this is the entire div with two smaller components, the left side and the right side. All right. So let's talk about, actually, let me use different colors to highlight specific things. Oh, this moved, but. Okay, let me use different colors to highlight what is what. Okay, so let's say I have this part over here. This part over here is equivalent to this part over here. So the yellow is equivalent to the yellow. And then the orange is equivalent to the orange here. That's how we're going to look at and see what's going on. So in this yellow section, there are two DCCs. And remember, DCC is dash core component. So the two things that we have here, I don't know why it keeps shifting. Maybe I do that. Okay, there we go. Never mind. So the two main components I have here, oh yeah, this helps, are a dropdown and a radio item. So the dropdown list I have here is this dropdown list. And then the radio items I have, whether it's linear or log. So you can see within this, within each DCC, you have a bunch of parameters that you can play around with. For the specific DCC, look up the documentation. Dash has a really, really good documentation, I think, because they have a lot of examples. But basically, every component has to have an ID. It has to have a name. This is how you identify what component. This is how you identify, if I change this, I want this other thing to update. So be very careful what you name your core component. So every core component has an ID.
One quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So here the log and the linear have been defined on the top, right?
Yes. That's actually for the next one. So that's actually for the radio items. See, we're doing linear and log there.
Mm-hmm.
But in the dropdown, we're only giving it like, these are the available indicators. So what you can select, those are the options. And then value is like a default value. So when you spin up your dashboard for the first time, before you even click anything, what's it going to show up first? So options is all of your possible options, and then value is what the default value is at the start. Kind of similar for radio items. Of course, you're going to give it a different ID, but your options are going to be linear or log, and your default is going to be linear. And of course, this is more on like the styles. And then this entire thing, the style outside of the two smaller divs, determines the style for this whole entire yellow part. And this width 49 is what makes it to the left side, so that with this next one, we can have it on the right side. Questions about this? All right, it's very, very similar on the other side. It's the same DCCs. We have our drop-down radio items. The only thing is with the style, how you get it to come up in two columns, like side by side, is that you have this width equals 49 and float to the right. And then this entire top bar, how it looks like it has, you know, see how it's like shaded a little darker here? you have the style for the entire top bar. So this style applies to both the yellow and orange part, which is why this top bar is slightly darker. So this entire part lays out that top bar. Note that here we haven't talked about, all right, if I choose a different indicator, what updates on the dashboard? We have not talked about that yet. This is literally physically where each component is, and then what data goes into each component by itself. All right, let me clear this real quick. Next, we're going to look at the graphs. And because we talked about that, the graph should be a little bit easier to understand. But here is our bottom big div, I guess you could say. Or I think it's actually in 3. So they have this one, and then the slider itself, the slider at the very bottom, I think it's in its own div. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this second div here has all our graphs. Something interesting, and we'll actually talk about it later when we talk about the callbacks. You can see that the graph, you're not actually defining what the graph is yet. So here they're just saying, all right, this is going to be a graph, but because we have no data, and because the data is going to be updated every time we change something, we'll deal with that later. For now, because we give it an ID, it's going to sort of act as a placeholder first. So this first graph is, let's see, this is the one that's on the left. So you have this scatter plot over here, and it's just going to be a DCC graph with no data first. I think at the very, very start, the default country that it hovers over is Japan, which is what it says here. And then on the right side, we have our 2 time series graphs. So you can see here is the X time series and the Y time series. And again, no data yet, because these are just placeholders for now. And then finally, in another separate div, we have this slider that's at the bottom. So you can sort of see that, and if I were to use some like rectangles to draw, you can see that this is one div. And because this is on the bottom, it's like in its own separate div, because by default, HTML goes top to bottom, which is why, yeah, this slider is its own thing at the bottom. Questions about the layout before I talk about callbacks? All right. Okay, so I would usually start with building the layout first. And once you have the layout built out, even if you have no data, it'll actually let you render. Actually, let me see if, hopefully this will work. Let's try this. And let's run this and then this. So it'll actually render, but as you can see, those are just placeholders. So therefore, it's not rendering correctly, but at least you can sort of get an idea of what it's going to look like. See, because you don't have data yet, it doesn't know that, okay, this one's got to be like smushed together, but at least you have like the main component still there. And when you move anything, nothing updates, see, nothing's happening here because it hasn't communicated that when I update something in like the slider, update the graph. So if you just have your layout, you can actually get something to just see and make sure that things are roughly looking what it's supposed to look like. Let's uncomment all of this. All right, so let's get into callbacks. Callbacks are, I will say, the most confusing, and you have to be very, very meticulous when you're working with callbacks. You'll see in a little bit, this, as long as you have callbacks, it's very, very important that you name the ID of everything in your layout, like something that represents what it is so that you know what exactly is going to be updated, so it's not ambiguous. So like, am I going to update like this graph or this graph? And in this case, they had defined it, I think they called it graph time series X time series Y. Sorry, let me zoom in a bit. I know it's a little small. All right, so let's first look at this big callback. So this entire thing is a callback. This, I mean, so anytime you see an @ sign on top of a defined function, there's actually a name for it. It's called a decorator function. You actually use decorators more with like object-oriented programming, but for this case, it can also be used to define callbacks for our dash. So @ callback basically is where you define, okay, what inputs and outputs are going to make this change. So in this case, you see that for this one graph, and you'll actually see that this outputs cross-filter indicator scatter. So cross-filter indicator scatter happens to be the name of this graph here. So you can see that this graph is, sorry, not this one. Where did it go? Cross-filter indicator scatter, right here. So this output is going to, whatever this function outputs is going to output in this placeholder. Next, you can see that there are what, 5 inputs? Yeah, there are 5 inputs here, and they are all in a list. So these inputs are going to be the cross-filter x-axis column, type, and slider. So basically 1, 2, whether it's linear or log, 3, whether this one is linear or log, 4, and then also the time slider, 5. It's not running right now because I had changed it. So let me just redo this. And we refresh this. Oh no, I hope I didn't break my graphs. Wow, okay. Never mind then. Sorry, everybody, I did not expect this to break. Okay, I'm just gonna really quickly copy over what they had again, just to make sure that we're working with the right one. Let me tell you, debugging a Dash app was the main reason why I thought I could never be a coder. So let me just copy and paste because I know that this one works. And we will recomment everything. Go, run server. There we go. Okay, good. That was a close call. All right. So we were talking about callbacks. Okay, so we have 5 things that will update this graph. So five core components can impact the output of this graph. So those will be our 5 inputs. So it's important to note here is there are 5 inputs, and then in this update graph function, there are 5 arguments. So you can see that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The column names for X and Y, type for X and Y, and the year value. The order of these arguments has to match the order of this list of inputs. That's something that I actually learned later on when I was debugging my app. And then within here is where you can do any like sort of data wrangling that you need to do. What's happening here is they're actually building the scatter plot with all of these different arguments. So you can sort of see here that this scatter plot, you have your X, your Y, and it comes from like the value. You also have the text. I think this is also like based on where you hover, so on and so forth. This is a pretty complicated scatter plot. So that's all of that. But basically your updating of the data, you do in this function here. Whether with every input, you subset it differently or you filter your data frame differently, you can do that here. So basically that's what this is returning. And this is returning basically the code for building that scatter plot. If you were to build a scatter plot just like this using Plotly, this is actually the exact
then you'll make.
can y'all hear me?
You're cutting out.
It's cutting out a little bit, and the sound kind of changed as well.
Okay, sorry about that.
Now.
Okay, good. Yeah, my like headphones said that it was cutting out. Okay, cool. I think we should be okay. So yeah, if you were doing this in Plotly, these would be like actual like columns, but because this is ideally you want it to be variable, so that's how you get it to change. You literally have it as your argument, and then it'll be able to update the graph based on what the input is. Other things to talk about here, you see how there are 2 arguments for every input and output. Less so for the output, but for the input, you can see that it is cross-filter x-axis column and then value. So let's go to cross-filter x-axis column. That is up here. It's actually going to take the value part.
Yes. Quick question. Now, on the input side, you have just mentioned it as column, and then on the other side, it's mentioned as column name. Why?
You mean like, oh, hold on. You mean for here, this is column and then column type?
No, here, if you see on the top, there you have column, and when you are on the update graph side, it says that column underscore name.
Column. Oh, you mean indicator name? Or
No.
oh, here.
Yeah,
Sorry, here. Column name. Got it. Okay. Yeah, I see the confusion. So this, it actually doesn't matter what you name it. It could be A, B, C, D, E, but it matches based on the order of the input. So it actually can be different words. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this could be A, B, C, D, E, but it knows to match. All right. First one will go A, second one will go B, third C, fourth D, fifth E. Yeah, that's a good thing to point out. So yeah, what I was saying earlier is that why you say value here is because it needs to know which part of that input do I use as the input. So from cross-filter X's column, cross-filter X-axis column, you're going to take in the value. And so this changes, so it's going to take in whatever the new indicator is. And same for all of the other inputs. And from all of that, that's how you update one single graph. Before we get into like the other callbacks, because these other callbacks just update like this graph and this graph. So I won't go into too much detail because it's pretty much the same concept. Before that, I also want to mention that let's say between one graph and another graph, you are going to do different, maybe you're doing like a log transform of one and a regular of the other, just like this one has here. You can actually have Python functions within your app that are not like a layout or a callback. So you can see here, this is just a function that exists by itself. It's not part of the callbacks. It's not part of the layout either. But this one just is a helper function to help you create the time series. I think this one's more of like based on if it is linear or log. So this just returns like a data dictionary of that, which these callbacks will end up calling on. Typically, I would suggest that if you are writing like functions to honestly put them at the top. Because if you're using any function, you have to make sure that the function is executed before the callback. So let's say if I put this callback above this time series function, the callback won't work. So it has to go, any helper functions that you're using has to be defined above the callback that's using it. Okay, so back to more callbacks. Let's just talk about the update X time series, which I think is this one. This time series, think about what affects it. So this drop down list changes it. So this one drop down and also this linear log also changes it. And then finally your hover, what country you're hovering on will also change that. So therefore you can see in the X time series, let me zoom in a little more. Hopefully this will make it, let's make this a little smaller. Okay. So here, that's why we have 3 inputs, which are, the 3 that I mentioned, and it outputs the Y time series. And the Y time series, remember, if you remember, that was our placeholder name here, Y time series. And then this is just a function that helps to subset that data frame for the appropriate data. Cool. I'm very aware that there's a lot of code just to create this like seemingly small dashboard. And there are a lot of components. There's a lot of like extra stuff. For example, anything that is like a style or like this is, I guess annotations are kind of important because you want to see like the hover data. But a lot of this are like add-ons, and each of these Dash core components has a lot of possible like customization features, styles, colors, options even. So if you see like a lot of these like additional, okay, like for example, these are like the colors of the markers. There's a lot of like not superfluous, but there's a lot of code that is not very, very essential to your dashboard in this sample code. When we go through the front ends, I'll do like a session on all different kinds of front ends. I'll have more templates, as I'll have like one of my own templates, but it's very, very, very simple, simpler than this. So I think this one might be a better one, just so that you can track like the callbacks better, rather than having to like create all new callbacks. I think the template example that I have has no callbacks. But yeah, I'm very aware that this is very intimidating. So no worries. Because I remember this being my like mod 1 project, I am actually surprisingly good at debugging it. So if anyone's working on a dashboard and needs help, this is not like super important to like data science concepts. So I'm more than happy to help debug this kind of thing. Debugging data science, I feel like I don't have to do so much of anymore, because you all should be able to do it yourselves at this point. But yeah, this stuff I'm more than happy to help debug, because I know it's like a different part of your brain that you're using to think about this stuff versus machine learning. So yeah, I'm going to, because earlier I had to like repaste this, I'm going to add comments just to like say what refers to what, and then upload a version of this notebook onto our study group repo. But with that, does anyone have any questions? All right, well, just know that creating a dashboard is a pretty big undertaking. If you're thinking that your project is going to need like a substantial amount of time to do on its own without a dashboard, you could leave your dashboard to work on like after you graduate. You know, you can definitely keep working on your project after graduation. The main point, and unfortunately we are time boxed with these 8 weeks. The main point is to get like the main like machine learning components, or like EDA and like conclusions. That's the most important part to get done during these 8 weeks. And then afterwards, you can still work on other components like a dashboard or a front end, so on and so forth. So yeah, is there no further questions?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Just on the project in general. So there were those planning sheets you gave us.
Yeah.
Are those for ourselves, or should we have something like that to give you?
That is for yourself. If you think that it would be useful for me to see and like help to plan out, because I think at this point a lot of the project like pitches that I've gotten are very like broad, and I know like it's mainly just like, oh, this is my idea and I want to do this. Therefore, you don't really need a planning sheet for that. But if you think that it's going to help you and me, you know, plan out the different components of your project, by all means, please send it over. It'll be helpful for me as well to just have something to like take notes on and like remember the details of your project. Because you think about it, I do have like 14 projects to keep track of at this time. So definitely it will be helpful if you send me something that is like documentation. And like, don't worry about filling every single part of the sheet out. And you can definitely add your own, like, you can definitely customize the sheets to however you think best represents your project, because everyone's project is going to be structurally different. And those are just like very broad and like general planners. So feel free to edit whatever you think makes sense.
Okay.
Awesome. Anything else? Sweet. For those of you who came in a little bit later after we started, I am light on 101s this week and next week. So in these 2 weeks, if you would like to book extra 101s, feel free to do so. And if you want to just like shoot me a Slack to double check if it's available, feel free to do that as well. But anything that you see on my 101 link should be fair game. All right, well, in that case, I will talk to you all on Thursday. I don't have anything planned to talk about. I was thinking I could do a deep dive on one of the bigger topics. I was thinking either NLP or time series, because that's what most of your projects are looking like so far. So I might do one of that, depending if I'm getting like depending on like how the 101s are looking over the next couple of days. But most likely I'll do like an overview of like the different NLP things that you could incorporate into your project. All right, well, in that case, have a good evening, everybody, and I will talk to you all back here at your 101s or on Thursday. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
You're welcome.